Hey guys, welcome to this next video, and in this video we'll discuss quite an important topic. This will be a comparatively short video, but we will discuss a quite important topic, and it's something that it's quite fundamental, and it's like one of the most important topic of machine learning, which is your train, test and validation set. And I won't read out any documents, don't worry. We'll just talk about in general what these are and what one biggest problem that I was making. I don't want to make that problem, make that mistake, sorry. So when you have your data, obviously you need data in data science, right? So in data science you have data. So when you train a machine learning model, when you're preparing a machine learning model, what you do is you divide data into different segments, right? And then there are three segments that you divide data. What is the idea behind dividing data into different segments? Is that you have different purpose for each segment, right? Or in other statistical term is that you are taking three different samples of your data, and in total those samples, when they combine, they make your whole data. But the idea is that you're making different samples of your data. Fine. Now we'll make a separate video on sampling, but just imagine you're making three portions of your data, or generally make two, but the third portion is quite important. So what you make is make your training data, okay, you made your test data, and you made your validation data. Now let's first see what they are. So when you're making a machine learning model, you have to give your machine learning model some data ki, hey, learn this data. When I'm saying learn, I don't want your model to completely memorize the data. I want your model to generalize the data. That is what we want. Learn the machine learning model, learn the training data. So when you have a machine learning model, let's say M is my machine learning model, right? So I'll fit my machine learning model on the training data. Okay, so M, or generally like this, M dot fit, right? And here will be my training data. Let's say I'm calling it TD, okay, in easier terms. So I'll fit my machine learning model with my training data. This will be the biggest chunk of my data. I'll train my machine learning on this data. Now once my machine learning model has learned the pattern, learned the trend, and whatever numbers and whatever crunches the number inside it, there's a complete mathematics for each algorithm. We'll discuss them separately. But whenever my model fits in the training data, it learns some parameters, and it, in general term, you can say it makes equation, right? It will make a function. You can say, let's say example, linear regression, right? So it will take a function to fit my model on this training data. You just make a function. Now what I can do, I'll pass new numbers and it will give me results. That is the idea of training data. Now of course, when I'm doing this training data, guys, I have both my independent variable. That is fine, but I'm fitting my model on my training data. That is what we have summarized till now. Now next thing, there are two data sets called test data and validation data. So validation data first. Validation data is something that is quite less used, right? When somebody begins learning data science, they don't use validation data and they realize it bad. So what validation data does is that now let's take example of a kid. Okay, so we were taking a kid, and that we are training that kid to learn, identify apples. Okay, we are taking that, we are training that kid to identify apples. And what happened, we showed him bunch of apples, right? Bunch of apples, like different shades of red, right? We showed them all kind of apple, different regions of apple, whatever apple were possible for us. We collected those apple and we showed him bunch of apples, right? Validation data would be a data set which would be used to validate your learning, right? In easy terms, you can say validate your learning, or you can say it's the data set that will be used to correct your model fit, right? So what I did, I had 100 apples. So in those 100 apples, I created 70 apples. I took 70 apples out randomly, and then I took 15 apples out, and then the 15 apples. So I did this random sampling, right? Okay, just pick those randomly, and I use these 70 apples. I make a kid understand all these 70 apples. Okay, so now they have understood, okay, this particular thing is called apple after seeing 70 different kind of apples. Okay, this is my training data. Then I showed them the validation data. Hey, these are also called apples. So what will happen in this case? What will happen in this case is that the student see, okay, I can easily recognize 12 or 13 of them, but there is one or two apples which are completely different, right? Which are which gives a bit different sort of vibe, or let's say they are green apples, right? Or they are different shape. So kid will also learn those one or two apples, and later they'll realize, okay, there are 15 more apples which they can test on. Okay, this is the basic idea of validation set, guys. Validation set gives you a good amount of unseen data for your training data, right? So my model has trained, it has learned something. Validation test, you can say it's like a mock test, right? It's a mock test, will give you a reality check. Okay, hey, this is what you should expect, right? And then you have your test data. Test data is your completely unseen data that you will implement on your end model, right? So test data, what we do, see, when I'm making a model, I need to test that model once. So let me just one quick thing. Let me just pick pin my charger here. I think it's okay, good to go. So validation data is kind of a mock test, and test data is something that we give a machine learning model. Hey, this is like an actual data that you should expect when you are out there in the industry. Okay, so that is how we break up our model, right? So let me tell you some quick fact. So when you make a test data, you don't touch your test data. You just forget your test data and use it at the end of your model when you think your model is completely trained and completely refined. Training data is used to train your model. It's the biggest chunk of your data. It's used to train your model, and it's used to make them understand like what's the biggest pattern, what going to be a trend, and generally it will be like 70-80% of your whole data. Validation data, on the other hand, it's a middle thing, right? It's once you have done training on your model, it's just to give your model a glimpse of how unseen data would look like. You use a validation data, right? Now this was for someone who does not know anything about machine learning or just the fundamental machine learning. If you're good in machine learning, now I'll say some advanced terms, so just be with me. So if you're good in machine learning, so you can say that validation data is the data that we use for hyperparameter tuning or cross validation, or whenever you're applying any method to actually refine your model, you use validation data for this. And this is the thing that I'm talking about. I have been making this mistake for like a year or 1.5 years of me working in an industry. But what I used to do is I used to use my training data for hyperparameter tuning or for cross validation. Specifically for hyperparameter tuning, I used to do my training data, which is not that correct a method. You should use the validation data for hyperparameter tuning or for cross validation, right? Reason being, what's the strongest reason for this? Reason being is that when you use your training data or your training data for your hyperparameter tuning, you are overfitting your model, right? Because you are asking your trained model to refine on the basis of training data. That is not the idea of hyperparameter tuning was. The idea of hyperparameter tuning was to give your model a bunch of parameters and then choose the best from it, right? So if you will do hyperparameter tuning on your training data, what will happen in this case is that your model is more prone to overfit, right? So reduce that overfitting. It's ideal to have a validation set created and use that validation set for hyperparameter tuning or for cross validation. So that is the main idea of validation set, guys. I have not been using it for that much that it should be used, but when I realized it has become a key part. Now in which cases we are not create validation set, right? So obviously there is a reason that we don't remember validation set, because we don't create it that much. So in cases where you have less data, let's say I have quite a less data, and in that data I'm creating a specific portion, so that will reduce my training data. Let's say I just have this much of data, or I have this much of data. So if I have this much of data, just a simple analogy, so if I have this much of data, it's easier for me to create this much of training data, this much of validation data, this test data, and this is my training data, right? But if I have less data, so if I'll create a validation set, if I'll create a training set, this is my test, this is my validation. So if I'll create a training set, if I'll create a validation set, I will reduce my data, right? I will reduce my data a lot. So in this particular case, we won't create a validation set, but generally, ideally, you should create a validation set. You should create a hyperparameter tuning and your cross validation and those refining of your model thing on the validation set, because it gives your trained model a reality check before going into a test model. So yeah, that was the main idea that I wanted to give you about test, validation and test set. These are three sections that you divide your data in, and all the individual section I use in individual places. Use your training data for training your model, use your validation data to refine your model, and you used your test data to have some play a role of completely unseen data that your model can expect in a real world scenario. So yeah, my name is Shumankit. I create content of data science. I teach data science. So you can connect with me. You can subscribe to my channel, and you can connect with me on LinkedIn, Instagram, and yeah, happy learning.